Trading for Micah Parsons is the biggest move the Falcons could make to transform them into a Super Bowl contender.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Now, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast, where I've been podcasting coming up on 9 years for Locked On Falcons this November. And I appreciate each and every one of you that go strong with me, even if you hate the AKAs, and all of you that go strong with me as everydayers, despite your disdain, all 6 of you for the AKAs, I appreciate you as everydayers. And all you got to do to become an everydayer and make this podcast your first listen each and every day is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we're going to talk about why Zach Robinson is the number one Penix pumper in the world, and talk about how we should interpret Penix's up and down practices and how that may translate into potentially an up and down regular season, at least to start in 2025. But we got to start the conversation talking about the big topic of the weekend, which is Micah Parsons potentially being on the trade block. And we're going to give a hypothetical, purely a hypothetical, but realistic trade proposal that the Falcons could make for Micah Parsons to the Dallas Cowboys that will, as we'll argue on today's episode, could be the thing that transforms the Falcons from an also ran to a potential Super Bowl contender. But for those of you that have missed the news on Friday, if you're out of the loop, Micah Parsons requested a trade on Friday after months of a stalemate or disrespect, using his terms, when it comes to the negotiation of his new contract. As you may or may not realize, Parsons is going into a contract year just like Kyle Pitts this year. And so, obviously wants a new deal and probably, compared, no offense to Kyle Pitts, but more deserving of a new deal based off of what he's done over the last 4 years. But according to himself, as well as other various NFL insiders and reporters, he and Jerry Jones and the Jones family met back in March. He thought they would discuss leadership for the upcoming season. They wanted to talk about his contract, and he came out of that meeting after talking with them about his potential contract, thinking, okay, now they're going to call my agent, David Mulugeta, arguably one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful agent in the NFL today, may also represent, Kyle Pitts, AJ Terrell, Jesse Bates, Darnell Mooney, among others, former Falcons like Casey Hayward and Calvin Ridley, future Falcons like Christian Wilkins. Anyway, but he thought, okay, we're going to get the ball rolling on this contract negotiation. And the Cowboys were like, no, we're not. We've already agreed to a deal. So it's good, right? Just come in and sign the deal. And, they essentially tried to go around arguably the most powerful agent in the NFL, and it's not working, right? And according to multiple indications, there has been little to no contact since that March meeting between the Dallas Cowboys and David Mulugeta. And so now Micah Parsons is, requesting a trade, not demanding a trade. And basically, this is a move that he and his side have to make as kind of a negotiation ploy, that if you're the player, because you have a contract and you're under contract, you really have 2 options here when it comes to wanting to, change your contract. Is you can either hold out, or I guess technically you could hold in. I think that's technically what Terry McLaurin is doing, where you show up, but you don't practice. Hold out is obviously you don't show up, or you can request a trade, right? And we've seen a number of players do this in the last couple of years. Brandon Ayuk, Lamar Jackson, Myles Garrett, all guys that requested trades, and I think in all 3 cases within 6 weeks got brand new deals from their respective teams. And obviously I think Micah Parsons is hoping that a similar situation will happen, and that's why we call it a negotiation play. It's a very public play and ploy from both sides. We get it from Micah Parsons' side. He's kind of, based off of all the reports, kind of been patient and held his tongue for 4+ months, hoping the deal would get done. Meanwhile, Jerry Jones is out here, in pressers at the beginning of training camp, taking shots at Micah Parsons and whatnot in the media. And so it all leads to this kind of current farce that is, the will they, won't they of paying Micah Parsons and whatnot. And I explained this to the Locked On Falcons Discord on Friday. It's kind of like that plot point in a badly written romantic comedy where, the central conflict between the two, romantic characters could be resolved with a 5-minute conversation. And you'll have one character, you often the guy, and at least the romantic comedies I see, where he's about to admit the thing that will avoid the conflict. And he's like, I need to tell you something. And the woman or the other partner basically says, okay, but first let me tell you this other thing that then prompts that person to not want to admit the thing that he's about to admit. And then they go, oh, but you were about to tell me something. What was that? And they go, oh, never mind. And so to me, like, that's kind of a similar situation where this could be easily resolved with a 5-minute conversation. Not to suggest that, they could hammer out an entire contract in 5 minutes over the phone, but you can have a good faith dialogue now with a simple 5-minute conversation over the phone with David Melgatt. Like, hey, yeah, we've been posturing, but hey, let's get a deal done. And I'm sure David Melgatt will be more than happy to yes, please. I don't get paid unless we get a deal done. So let's get a deal done. Nobody gets paid unless we get a deal done. So that's kind of the situation. Jerry Jones is going to be Jerry Jones. He did this last year with CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott, and CeeDee held out. Dak did not. And they spent a lot of time posturing back and forth publicly. We don't want to pay Dak, and we'll wait it out. And then they wound up paying Dak, and it's like, oh, we'll see what happens with CeeDee. And it's like, then they paid him, right? And it's a lot of it is because Jerry Jones doesn't believe in the notion that he doesn't believe in bad press, right? Any press is good press. And I know the Locked On Cowboys guys, Marcus and Landon, disagree with that notion. I agree with them that there is bad press. It's all stupid and dumb, and it ultimately hurts the Cowboys, to sort of drag out these negotiations for no reason and have a very sort of public animosity between both sides for no reason. And, I think a lot of it is just because the Cowboys have not been nearly as relevant on the field as they would ideally like to be. And so Jerry Jones takes it upon himself to make them as relevant as possible off the field. And I don't think these actions really make you relevant at all. Yes, you are the lead story on ESPN and NFL Network. Yes, you are being discussed on Locked On Falcons of all places. But it just all makes you look like a poorly run and incompetent organization. And so I know I'm going to be a hypocrite and basically say, Jerry's just doing this to get attention, and we're going to give him the attention that he wants on this show. But I know for a lot of you guys, we talked about the possibility of a Micah Parsons trade last summer, I believe last July. And so I know some of you guys are like, Aaron, this is the prophet, right? You predicted this. And then it's like, I don't know if I think my actual prediction was that a trade could happen, but the Cowboys are going to make it as dramatic as possible. And that feels like, yes, that's where the prophecy was foretold, that they're making it as dramatic as possible. Just pay that man his money, to use the words of Teddy KGB. Just, hammer out of 42 million, 43 million, whatever, and 100 million guaranteed. Give him the Kirk Cousins contract and be done with it. Like, that will solve so many problems. But they gotta make it a bigger deal. They gotta play up the theatrics. They gotta do all the stuff. And so I say all that because even though we talked about the possibility of Micah Parsons trade last summer and at various points in the last calendar year, I don't think a trade is going to happen. The Cowboys have already stated that they're not going to trade him. And to me, like, if the Cowboys were serious about trading Micah Parsons, it would have happened in the spring, right? And the main reason for that is because if you're going to trade Micah Parsons, you're losing a ton of on-field value, and you want to get some value back. And if you trade him now in August, you're not really going to get that value back until 2026, as opposed to in 2025. Had you traded him back in March or April, you could have at least gotten something in, back on the field in 2025. But that being said, we're going to continue today's episode giving a very hypothetical trade proposal that I think is at least realistic based off of past trades, and the way that the Falcons can kind of work around that. And maybe, and again, this is a very hypothetical world where this trade is real, the way that the Falcons can give the Cowboys some on-field value in 2025 is to give up James Pierce Jr., and we'll break down those trade proposals as well as why James Pierce Jr. Would be the trade asset as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So it is time to fuel up and turn it up with 5-Hour Energy Transfusion. Bring that bold grape, ginger, and lime flavor of your favorite golf drink, minus the alcohol, into a quick, energizing shot. And whether you're sinking birdies or just making memories with friends, this one's a hole-in-one for your energy game. We know Michael Penix is trying to up his golf game, and maybe the 5-hour energy transfusion shot with its grape ginger lime flavor is not only going to give him the best parts of his clubhouse go-to without chasing down the bev cart, and also keep him sharp and energized, and it can for you. If you go to 5hourenergy.com today, that's the number 5hourenergy.com, you can use the promo code LOCKEDONGolf to receive a 20% off your order. This offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders, but whether you're meeting up with friends or trying to turn 18 holes into 36, get the energizing boost you need to power through by ordering the transfusion flavored 5-hour energy shots today. So I want to again reiterate, this is mostly a hypothetical. This is more of a thought experiment. And again, we're playing into Jerry Jones's hands by giving him the attention that he wants, mostly because this is far more compelling conversation than talking about Grayland Arnold and what he's going to bring to the Falcons secondary. I did share my thoughts on the Grayland Arnold signing and the Killian Zaire release, Zero, whatever. Sorry, Killian. don't need to memorize how to pronounce your name now. But to the Locked On Falcons insiders, so of course, great place to go if you want to get deeper cuts on back end roster moves by joining that link in the description below. But basing this, what I think is a realistic trade proposal for Micah Parsons, based off of 4 previous trades that I'm aware of. Maybe I'm missing one, but that involved non-quarterbacks that were involved multiple first-round picks. That's Khalil Mack, Jamal Adams, Jalen Ramsey, and Laramie Tunsil. And I'm using the Rich Hill trade value chart to calculate what these teams gave up to try to give a realistic portrait of what the Falcons might give up in a trade for Micah Parsons. And for those of you that don't know, the draft trade value charts are basically assigning points to each draft pick as a way to figure out, if we give you these 2 picks, what can we get back, all that sort of stuff. And there's 2 main ones. There's the Jimmy Johnson trade value chart, which former Cowboys coach Jimmy Johnson, I believe, came up with in the late 80s, has been kind of the foundational trade value chart for the last 35 plus years in the NFL. And then there's the Rich Hill trade value chart with a Patriots fan, I believe, came up with in 2018, looking back at like the 5 or so previous years and the actual trades that had happened in the NFL, and sort of figuring out on the back end what the picks are worth. So it's a more realistic proposal. The main difference between the two is the Jimmy Johnson trade value chart arguably overvalues, like top 5 picks, which matters in this conversation because the Tunsil trade involved what turned out to be the 3rd overall pick in the 2021 draft, which was part of the Trey Lance saga. And that kind of made that trade look more expensive than it probably should be. And so we're going to use the Rich Hill to give a more realistic and grounded one. But that being said, the Tunsil trade accounted for about of these 4 trades, the most was 869 points according to Rich Hill trade value chart, which is basically the equivalent of 2 firsts and 2 seconds. And then the Khalil Mack trade, surprisingly, was the low end, which 435 points, which basically was a first and a second round pick that essentially the Bears gave up for him to the Raiders. And I don't think the Cowboys are going to trade Micah Parsons for that lower price. So I think it's much more likely that we'll get somewhere between, that's the floor, the ceiling. Tunsil's the ceiling, Max the floor, the eye level somewhere in the Jalen Ramsey, Jamal Adams range, in between those 2 points. And the way that I'm calculating the point totals is I'm using the Falcons' projected 2026 second round pick, which based off of current Super Bowl odds is the 43rd overall pick, which would be worth 138 points. I know if they actually pulled off this Parsons trade, that pick would probably change in value. I'm using what the average first round pick is worth, the 16th overall pick for, future 2027 and beyond first round picks for the Falcons. For those of you not in the loop, the Falcons do not possess a 2026 first round pick because of the James Pierce trade. And, I'm calculating James Pierce to be worth 226 points because that's the 26th overall pick is what that pick is worth as part of this calculation is to make these trade proposals. So to me, the middle ground between that Tunsil ceiling and that Mac floor is basically the Falcons giving up that 2026 second round pick, the Falcons giving up their 2027 first round pick, and the Falcons giving James Pierce up. And then if you calculate what the Adams and Ramsey trades were worth, in theory, the Falcons could get a 4th round pick based off of the Adams price tag, 4th round pick back, or for the Ramsey price tag, they would get a 2nd round pick back. Now, so my official projection on what a realistic Micah Parsons trade would be The Dallas Cowboys would receive the Falcons 2026 second round pick, their 2027 first round pick, and James Pierce Jr., and the Falcons would get Micah Parsons and a 2027 third round pick, basically splitting the difference between that second and fourth round pick. And the reason why it's a 2027 third round pick is because the Cowboys don't have a 2026 third round pick due to the George Pickens trade earlier this offseason. So, you're sitting there wondering why would we trade James Pierce, the training camp superstar, instead of Jalen Walker, right? Because Jalen Walker is often comped to Micah Parsons. Why wouldn't the Cowboys prefer Jalen Walker to replace Micah Parsons? Two reasons, right? The Cowboys had James Pierce in for a top 30 visit prior to the draft. And you've heard me wax poetic over the years that player visits and all that stuff is not that meaningful for the Falcons and most NFL teams. But from what I understand, it is particularly meaningful for the Cowboys. They tend to be very transparent, from what I understand, when it comes to they bring in the players that they're interested in drafting for their top 30 visits, as opposed to other teams like the Falcons who are doing their they do have some interest in those players, but a lot of it's more due diligence than necessarily we're definitely drafting these guys. Although James Pierce is a good example of a player that they did wind up drafting. But the second reason why Pierce over Walker is based off of outside of Micah Parsons' selection and arguably Donovan Ezeraku. Most of the edge rushers the Cowboys have targeted are more traditional defensive ends, which is more what James Pierce is than Jalen Walker. And again, the fascinating thing about Micah Parsons and why we always talk about Micah Parsons being this outlier is that the Cowboys initially drafted him to be a linebacker, and it wasn't until about midway through his second season before they fully committed to him being only an edge rusher. And what will be a fascinating irony is if the reverse happens with Jalen Walker, which is the Falcons drafting him to be an edge rusher, and then midway through his second season, they decide to commit fully to making him a linebacker. But that's a conversation for a different day. But, I think the main selling point of why the Falcons would do this trade is just the proven production that Micah Parsons would provide this team over the next 5 years, which presumably would be Parsons' prime, the remainder of his prime. He's 26 years old. We've talked before, whether it's about Trey Hendrickson and Matthew Judon and Leonard Floyd, that edge rushers tend to lose a step around 31, 32. So 5 years would take you through his age 31 season. And if you map out the projection for what Parsons' pass rush production and sack production would be over the next 5 years, that you would potentially have him, I calculated this based by looking at, Parsons' first 4 year production compared to Von Miller's first 4 year production, which is very similar. Parsons is slightly more in terms of sack production. And then sort of mapping out what Von Miller's next 5 years were before he had his injury in his age 31 season. And it hasn't been, it's still been very good, but it hasn't been quite the same player since, which again reiterates that point about, when you can expect a decline. That would map out to about Parsons having about 12.2 sacks on average over the next 5 years. He's averaged over 13 sacks his first 4 years. Von Miller was like 12 something and then 11 something. And so that would be about 61 sacks on it combined over the next 5 years. Now that's a significant number compared to what projections of James Pierce and Jalen Walker could be based off of the sack-seer metric, which was created by Football Outsiders, now FTN Fantasy, that basically looks at college production and athletic testing to map out the first 5 year projections for a lot of high-end draft picks. And with James Pierce, their projection, sack-seer projects him to have 19.3 sacks over his first 5 NFL seasons, and Jalen Walker is projected to have 17.9 sacks over that. And so combined, they would combine for about 37 sacks over the next 5 years, compared to the 61 sacks that Micah Parsons would give you, which is almost 5 sacks more per season, which probably calculates for about 10 to 12% higher production for Micah Parsons. Micah Parsons is going to make your pass rush at least 10% better than what James Pierce and Jalen Walker are going to provide. So that's the main reason why you would make this trade if you're the Falcons. Now, you're sitting there saying, that sack-seer production, it can't be that low or whatever. And it's like, again, sack-seer is not meant to be the end-all be-all, but it's a useful tool when we're having this conversation about what can we realistically expect from James Pierce and Jalen Walker. And for those out of the loop, it has been pretty accurate when it comes to former Falcon first-round edge rushers. Vic Beasley was projected to have 34 sacks over his first 5 seasons. He finished with 37.5, so about a 10% difference, margin for error. Tack McKinley was projected to have 22.7 over his 5 years. He finished with 20, and arguably probably would have gotten to about 23 had he not been injured in 2020, based off of his production in those 4 games that he was healthy. So roughly again another 10% margin for error. So, that would say, okay, roughly, Pearson Walker will probably give you about 35 to 40 sacks over the next 5 years on average. So we'll see on that front. But, that's the reason why you would trade for Micah Parsons, the proven production, as opposed to the unknown with Walker and Pierce, who could, be far below that projection or far higher that projection, but you just don't know. And so, I think that means it's ultimately a good trade for the Falcons to make, but I don't think it's a slam dunk, right? And the way that I would explain that is looking at the Julio Jones trade, where I feel like, that was a net positive, but wasn't purely a positive. And, we'll go deeper into that and why that trade and why Micah Parsons could single-handedly, like Julio Jones did, transform the Falcons into a Super Bowl team. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, if you're looking for last-minute tickets to head on down to the ballpark to see what's what with this, struggling Braves team, Game Time is the place to go because they have the killer last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% off, since prices on the app drop the closer you get to your event, whether it's a baseball game, other sports event, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you. And the beauty of Game Time is you don't have to worry about scrolling through thousands of tickets to find the best deals because they have their zone deals, which are going to pick the best seats in your section for you. You have the panoramic seat views, no hidden fees at checkout, and the Game Time guarantee is going to have your back when it comes to cancellation protection and more. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, talked about, the Julio Jones trade being a good parallel for this Micah Parsons hypothetical trade. And again, I want to stress, this is purely a hypothetical, but again, it's an interesting and compelling thought experiment. And if you're a relatively new listener to the podcast or, don't know my thoughts on the Julio Jones trade, I think it was a net positive, but I don't think it was 100% positive. I think there was a give and a take with that. And I think the similar thing would happen with a hypothetical Micah Parsons trade, where I think the give, what you got, the pro of that Julio Jones trade is you could argue he single-handedly transformed the Falcons into a Super Bowl team, taking that team from where they were as a good team in 2010 to 10 yards away from the Super Bowl in 2012. I won't go as far as to say they were a great team, but they were a better team in 2012 that had a legit Super Bowl chance because of the explosive potential that Julio Jones added that was sorely lacking from that team in 2010. But I think the con of the Julio trade was you could argue that the picks that they gave up were directly responsible for the ensuing struggles that came after 2012, where you saw, injuries and age and retirements to kind of deplete that 2012 roster in 2013 and 2014, which led to the downfall of Mike Smith, where you had a number of players from 2011 2012 that were major contributors to those teams that were not major contributors, whether they were hurt, whether they signed elsewhere, whether they retired, etc. Guys like Roddy White, Tyson Clabo, Todd McClure, John Abraham, Tony Gonzalez, William Moore, Sean Weatherspoon, Michael Turner, Brent Grimes, Asante Samuel, etc. Right? And the Falcons did not do a good job replenishing that talent lost in those years because they didn't have the draft assets to do so. And the few that they retained, they did not spend well with the Peter Conses and the Lamar Holmeses and all those Akeem Dents and all that stuff. So essentially, like the Julio trade, you're hoping for a short-term game, which is transforming the Falcons into a Super Bowl team, but the likelihood is you'll have a long-term loss, right, where you won't have the draft assets to replenish whatever talent you lose. And so therefore, I think in a hypothetical where you trade for Micah Parsons, you're hoping that it gives you a 2 to 3 year window to win a Super Bowl, and you need to maximize that window. And basically the idea is Parsons is going to single-handedly kind of transform your defense into a top 10 unit. And you hope that you've already kind of built most of what is going to be a top 10 offense plus a top 10 defense. That's basically a team that should be a potential front runner and strong contender to be a Super Bowl team. but it's going to be really hard for you after that 2 or 3 window to replenish the talent or add to the talent that you may find out if you're not as good as you hope to be, right? Because we've talked before about the potential turnover that's going to happen on both sides of the ball for the Falcons, where like, yeah, you feel great about Michael Penix and Drake London and Bijan Robinson being core players for your offense, but you might have to wind up replacing most of the other 8 guys, minus probably Chris Lindstrom, on your offense over the next 2 or 3 years. And that's where, your potential to maintain being a top 10 offense is going to be hard for your team. And the same things with your defense, where, yeah, you got, AJ Terrell and Micah Parsons in the prime, and you're hoping that the draft picks that you used in the last couple of years will also elevate your defense. But, you have some players like Jesse Bates, who probably not going to be the same player in 3 years. Caden Ellis, diminishing, being past 30, all that stuff. So, you kind of have to be, in order to justify a Micah Parsons rate, you have to be pretty confident that you're like 90% of the way already to being a Super Bowl team, because it's unlikely you're going to make significant improvements to your roster over the next 2 off seasons or replenish talent that you may lose over the next 2 off seasons, because we know the picks that you're going to wind up keeping, are day 2 picks, right? Because you've already given up your first round pick next year. You're giving up your second round pick next year. You're giving up your first round pick the following year. And so you only have a third round pick in this hypothetical situation next year in the second and third round pick. And we know that day 2 selections have not been Terry Fontenot's strength so far in his tenure as a general manager. He's had a lot more misses than hits up to this point. Again, maybe that changes as we look back at, the most recent drafts and whatnot, but it's going to be a question mark. And so it makes sense for the Falcons to, potentially pull the trigger on this, because nothing else you're probably going to do in the next year or 2 is going to move the needle like a Micah Parsons trade would do. But ultimately, how much you are in favor of this hypothetical trade really kind of depends on how far along you think the current version of the Falcons are, right? If you currently think the Falcons are like the 4th best team in the NFC, then probably trading for Micah Parsons probably jumps them to be potentially the number 1 or number 2 team in the NFC, and therefore a potential Super Bowl contender / front runner. If you're like me and others, I'm sure, that tend to think based off of what the Falcons have proven so far, again, it's not to say that they can't be the 4th best team. It's just, as we sit here today, they've only proven themselves to be closer to the 8th best team in the NFC. Trading for Micah Parsons is going to maybe jump you to the number 4 spot, which is going to make you a playoff team and guarantee your playoff success, which certainly I think you're incentivized if you're Terry Fontenot or Raheem Morris and certainly, our octogenarian owner, Arthur Blank, to want. So it makes sense why you would want to make that move to quote unquote guarantee your playoff chances. But your ability to become a Super Bowl contender, to maximize that 2 to 3 year window that we're talking about, really at that point is going to bend on, is Michael Penix the type of quarterback that can get you from what we're talking about, which is, if you're the 4th best team in the NFC, that's a team that probably is going to be a second round playoff team. But to get you that last little hump, can he be that high end top 10, top 8-ish quarterback that is going to be able to win, get you past the second round of the playoffs? And so ultimately that kind of is what determines whether or not you think this is a good trade or not. Again, at the end of the day, I kind of look at it as going like, yeah, go for it. What else are we going to do, right? But at the same time, my stance would be, again, purely hypothetical. In this hypothetical world, go for it. In favor of trying to take advantage of the opportunity that you have in front of you, that that you have relatively, you have, where like, let's try to maximize the next 2 or 3 years. But at the same time, like, I would probably be less optimistic that it will ultimately result in the way that the Falcons want it to play out, which is winning a Super Bowl in the next 2 or 3 years. And it's like, okay, well, you're going to try for it in the next 2 or 3 years. Might as well do it. What else are you going to do again? But you're probably, if it fails, you're going to have to bring in somebody to be the Dan Quinn to basically the current regime's Mike Smith at that point in time. So that's kind of how I feel about this very, very hypothetical Parsons trade. So, a first, a second, James Pierce for a chance to win a Super Bowl in the next 2 years. Yeah, to me, I'll give that up. Will it actually result in a Super Bowl? Probably not, if you ask me. But again, I'm sure your mileage may vary. So I'll be curious to see how you guys sort of view it. If you think that's enough, if you think that's too much, I'm sure there will be a healthy debate in the comments. People will be very civil about it. I know we were going to talk about Zach Robinson and the Michael Penix ups and downs, but talking about the Parsons trade, it's just a little too rich. And so we'll punt that conversation to tomorrow. But basically the gist of that, spoiler alert, is, Michael Penix having up and down practices is probably going to mirror some ups and downs early in the season. So I don't think anybody should be too negative about Penix having some ups and downs like he had arguably over the weekend on Friday. But I don't think you should be completely ignored either. So it's kind of telling to me, but again, that's probably something that we'll explore potentially on tomorrow's episode. So, continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen to get that insight. Did a whole episode on Micah Parsons. Really thought I would only do 20 minutes instead of 30 minutes, but Jerry, you got me this time. So that is going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. For your second listen, make sure you check out Locked On Bets. Lee Sterling, Kevin Rogers will give you all those MLB locks as well as football futures. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.